The pallet on the floor was her bed from age 8. A Lakota chief built her a bed of cedar and fir. The cedar took me 4 days. I want you to understand that first, before anything else. Before the winter I am about to tell you about, before the woman, before the thing that changed in me when I finally understood what I was looking at. I want you to understand the cedar, because the cedar is how this whole story lives or dies. I am not a man who speaks easily about what moves inside him. That is not weakness, and it is not hiding. It is simply the way my father was, and his father before him, and the way our people have always known that some things said aloud lose the very quality that made them worth carrying. You hold a thing close long enough, and it becomes yours in a way it cannot be if you open your hands too wide too soon. But I am older now than my father ever got to be, and I have spent enough winters alone on the high ground watching the country below me that I have learned there are some things a man ought to say before the chance is gone. So I will say this one. Her name was Clara Marsh, and the first time I saw her she was wrapped in a piece of canvas tarp, sleeping in the back of a freight wagon 2 miles outside of Sage Creek in the middle of November, and the temperature that night had dropped below what a wolf would tolerate. I will back up to where it properly begins. My name is Standing Elk. My Lakota name is longer and means something closer to the elk who does not move when the wind brings danger, who reads it, stands into it, and decides. My mother gave me that name because I came into the world during a storm that lasted 3 days and I did not cry once. I think she may have been flattering me, but I have tried to live into it. That is the most any name can ask of a man, that he try to live into it. I was 43 years old that winter. I had been leading my band, not a large one, perhaps 60 people, 3 extended family lines, for 11 years, since my uncle died of the fever that came through in the years when the territories were reshaping themselves, and the army was building forts in places where forts had no business being. 60 people is not a nation. But 60 people in the high plains in the 1870s, with the buffalo thinning and the agency people pressing from every direction, and the winters coming earlier than they used to, is a weight that sits on a man's chest the way a stone sits on a carcass. You can move, you can breathe, but you are never entirely free of what is pressing down. I am not going to tell you about politics. This is not a story about that, though it runs through every part of it the way cold runs through everything in November. What I will say is this. I had learned by 43 that the best thing I could do for my people was to be steady. Not loud, not grand, steady. A man who kept his word, managed what he could manage, let go of what he could not, and woke up the next morning and did the same. That is not nothing. Some days on the high plains in winter it is everything. My uncle taught me most of what I know about leading. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make speeches in the way that some chiefs make speeches, with the arms wide and the voice carrying. He gave instructions quietly. He listened more than he spoke, and he never asked anyone to do a thing he would not do himself. He was the first one up in the morning and the last one inside in the evening, and in between he was present for whatever the day required. He died owing nothing to anyone, and with his people intact, which he told me once was the only measure that mattered when you are responsible for the lives of others. I have thought about that a great deal over the years. What it costs to keep your people intact, what a man gives up, and what he holds on to, and how you learn to tell the difference. I had also learned, and this came later, harder, that a man who leads, who is responsible for the lives of others from the time he is old enough to know what responsibility means, sometimes goes a long time without anyone being responsible for him in return. Without anyone seeing him, not the role, not the steadiness, not the function of him, but the actual man underneath all of it. I am not complaining about this. I had good people around me, good cousins, good elders who still talked to me the way an elder talks to a young man, even after I had been leading for a decade. I was not lonely in the way some men get lonely and can't name it. But there was something I had closed off, or that had closed by itself, the way a wound closes, not because anyone bandaged it, but because the body learns to work around what's gone. I had been married once. Her name was Morning Lake, and she was the best person I have ever known in terms of the texture of daily life, the small, constant quality of a person, the way they handle the ordinary moments that make up most of a life. She was funny and she was careful and she understood horses better than most men I know. She died in childbirth when I was 31, and the baby with her. I will not go into that further, except to say that I did what men do. I put it somewhere that didn't interfere with the work, and I kept going. 12 years is a long time to keep going without putting anything back. Now November, the Sage Creek Freight Road. I was riding back from a meeting with the agency man. A long day, a frustrating one, the kind where nothing is agreed and nothing is refused, and you ride home with the same stone on your chest you rode out with, just arranged differently. These meetings had a particular flavor by then, something sour and rehearsed on their end, and I had learned to manage my own reaction to them the way you manage fire in dry grass, carefully and without letting it spread. I had two of my cousins with me, Broken Bow and his younger brother whom we called Little Axel because he had fixed a wagon axle at age 9 with nothing but a rock and a piece of rawhide, and we never let him forget it. He didn't mind. He was proud of it, which was the right way to feel. It was dark. The moon was partial, but there was enough to see by, and I knew this road the way I know the lines on my own hands. We were 2 miles from where we would camp for the night and then head home in the morning, and Little Axel said something and pointed, and I looked where he was pointing. A freight wagon. It had a broken front wheel, not just cracked. The whole hub was gone, the axle end sitting in the dirt at an angle that told you it had come apart at speed, and the wagon had kept going some distance before the driver got it stopped. Whoever had been driving had left it, or been forced to. There was no horse hitched. The horse was gone too, either cut loose deliberately or bolted in the dark when the wheel went. The traces were snapped, not cut, so the horse had panicked and pulled out of it, which meant it was probably halfway back to Laramie by now. And in the back of the wagon, under a piece of canvas tarp that covered most of her but not her feet, was a woman. I pulled up and sat for a moment. Little Axel looked at me. Broken Bow looked at me. And I did what I have learned to do when a situation presents itself before you have had time to think about it properly. I got down. She was white. Young, maybe 22, 23, hard to say because her face was drawn in the way that comes not from age but from use, like a tool that has been worked hard and not maintained. She was not unconscious, exactly, more like that state just below conscious, where the cold has gotten into the thinking part of a person and the thinking part has stopped insisting on things. Her lips were grayish. Her hands, when I touched the backs of them, were colder than they should have been for how long she'd been there. I said her name. I didn't know her name then. I just said something, a sound, to bring her back up to the surface. She opened her eyes. They were the color of creek water in early spring, that greenish-gray that is neither one thing nor the other, and clear in a way that surprised me considering what her body was doing. There was something alert in them that the cold hadn't reached yet, something in there that was still fully present and watching. She looked at me for a long moment without fear, which also surprised me. Most white women in that country in that year, finding themselves in that situation in the dark with 3 Lakota men standing over them, would have been afraid. She was not. Later she told me she had been too cold to be afraid, which I understood to be the truth, and also perhaps not the whole truth. She said, "Is the horse gone?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought so. I heard him go about 2 hours back. I was trying to decide what to do." She said it the way you say it when you have been deciding things on your own for so long that you do not expect help to arrive from any direction, so you make your plans for the version where it doesn't. Not self-pity in it, just habit. The planning that happens when you have learned that the cavalry is not coming, that the cavalry has in fact never come, and so you factor that in from the beginning. I wrapped her in my own blanket. I lifted her out of the wagon. she weighed less than she should have, which registered in my hands and did not leave me, and I got her up on my horse, and I rode the rest of the way to camp holding her in front of me, my arm across her to keep her from listing to one side while her body started to figure out it was going to be warm again. Little Axel went ahead to get the fire going. Broken Bow rode behind, quiet. He is good in situations that require quiet. That is how it began. Her name, I learned in the morning by the fire, was Clara Marsh. She had been driving that freight wagon herself, which was not common, and she knew it, and did not seem to feel it required explanation. She had been hauling goods, mostly dry goods and some hardware, from Laramie to a dry goods store in Sage Creek, a regular route she had done 3 times before, and the wheel had given out on this stretch of road which was not maintained the way a road of that use ought to be maintained. And the horse had panicked in the dark at something in the brush, maybe a coyote, and snapped the trace on the left side and pulled free, and that was that. She did not ask why I'd helped her. She did not thank me effusively, which I respected. She drank the broth my cousin's wife handed her, both hands around the cup, and she looked at the fire, and she ate something, and after a while she said, "Is there any way I could get back to Sage Creek by tomorrow? I have another haul due in 3 days, and I'll need to sort out the wagon situation." Broken Bow thought this was the funniest thing he'd heard in some time. He had the decency to wait until she was out of earshot, and when he came back around the fire his face was neutral again, which took more effort than he was letting on. I asked her a few things. Not from nosiness. I needed to know what we were dealing with, whether there was someone who would come looking for her, whether there was something more complicated underneath the surface story. There usually is, with people in difficult situations on empty roads. There was. Her family, what there was of it. A stepfather in Laramie she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. A mother who had died when Clara was young, of something that happened fast. A brother who had gone to California at 17 and never written. She had been doing this work, freight hauling, and before that laundry work, and before that whatever jobs a woman alone could find in a territory's town, since she was about 15. Before that, she said, she'd been with family, and she said it in the flat tone that tells you the word doesn't mean what it usually means to her. I asked carefully about where she'd been sleeping. She'd been in the back of the wagon for 3 weeks. It was cheaper than the boarding house, she said, and the boarding house had gotten expensive when one of the 2 women who ran it left and the remaining one put the price up. She had done the math, and the wagon was the better option. I said before the wagon, and she said at the laundry. A pallet on the floor in the back room. The owners let her have it in exchange for opening up in the mornings before they arrived. She said it the way you say the color of a wall. A detail. A fact about the world that has no particular emotional charge, because you stopped giving it emotional charge a long time ago. I said, how long ago? She thought about it. She said, since I was 15, I've had, she counted on her fingers without really counting, just touching them, a room twice and a floor most of the rest. Before that, floor mostly too. I said, from the time you were 15. She said, from before that. I said, how far before? She looked at the fire. She said, 8. When my mother died, I went to live with my stepfather's people and there wasn't a room to spare. Kitchen floor. She paused. It was fine. It was fine. I held that. I let it sit in me where it landed, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. I have known loss. I have known hardship. The high plains in winter are not gentle with people who aren't paying attention. But there is something particular about a child on a floor, the specific quality of that image, the smallness of it and the largeness of what it means, that settled in me like a stone settling to the bottom of still water. It was going to stay there. I could feel it going to stay there. She looked up and caught whatever was on my face because she said, "Don't look at me like that." I said I wasn't looking at her any particular way. She said, "You are," but without heat in it, more like a correction of the record. She said, "It wasn't so terrible, plenty of people have less." I said, "Plenty of people have more." She looked at me for a moment and then back at the fire. She almost smiled. The first time I saw that, small and quick and mostly in the eyes, gone almost as soon as it came. She said, "That's true." We got her to Sage Creek by the next afternoon. One of my cousins rode back and found the wagon, and we brought it in behind us. The wheel was done, but the goods inside were intact and accounted for, and she could get credit for the haul. The freighting office was run by a man named Dortmund who had the habit that some men have of speaking to the wall behind a woman rather than to the woman herself. And when I saw him starting to do that, I placed myself in the conversation in a way that redirected his attention. He was not comfortable. He was not meant to be. She got the full credit, and a note that the late arrival was due to road conditions. She stood at the edge of that exchange with the receipt in her hand, and she looked at me after Dortmund had gone back to his desk. She said, "That was more than you needed to do." I said it was the right thing. She looked at me. She said, "Where do you go from here?" I told her, "North and West Home Range 3 days out." She nodded. I thought that was the end of it, a thing that had happened on a road, resolved, complete. I was wrong about that. I did not see her again for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, I ran the winter business of leading 60 people in hard country. There is a great deal to that, and none of it is poetic. It is horses and food stores and firewood, and the constant calibration of disputes before they become injuries, and the management of the young men whose energy can be a resource or a liability depending on the hour and how hungry they are. It is a continuous reading of the sky. It is decisions made with partial information at all hours of the day, and sometimes in the middle of the night when someone comes in with a problem that could not wait. And it is the performance of certainty even when you are not certain, because your people need you to hold steady so they can hold steady. A chief who shows doubt at the wrong moment is a stone wall with a crack in it. It will hold, usually, but everyone can see the crack and nobody believes in the wall the same way. I thought about her. I want to be honest about that. Not constantly. I had 60 people in a hard winter to manage and no shortage of things for my mind to work on. But when I had a moment in the early dark before anyone else was up, saddling a horse by feel in the cold, or lying awake with the wind working at the lodge walls, I would find myself back at that fire or in that freighting office, watching the way she looked at me. Not the way most people look at me. Not with need, not with assessment, not with the calculation that says, "What can this man do for or against me?" She looked at me the way you look at something you are genuinely curious about, without agenda in the looking, without wanting anything from it except to see clearly. People don't look at me that way. I am useful to people, which is fine. Being useful is the job, but it does something to a man over time, being seen primarily as the function of himself. You start to wonder if the man underneath the function is still there, or if he has been so thoroughly converted to use that the use is all there is. I told myself it was nothing. I had 60 people in a hard winter. There were more important things. I told myself that several times over 6 weeks, and by the 6th week I was telling it to myself less frequently, which should have told me something. And then December came hard, colder than November, ice in the creek by the 1st week, the horses tight and unhappy, and with it a rider from Sage Creek. The rider was a young freighter named Toll, who occasionally carried messages for small pay. He had a note from the dry goods man in Sage Creek, a Swede named Peterson, who was one of the 3 or 4 white men in that part of the territory I had found I could speak with without feeling like I was speaking into a wall. Peterson's note said, "The Marsh woman has been sleeping in the freight office since the boarding house raised the rate again. It has gotten very cold. She won't take charity." He had added in smaller writing at the bottom, "I thought you ought to know." I read the note twice. I read it a 3rd time because I wanted to be sure I was reading what I was reading and not what I expected to read. I asked Toll how long she had been there. He said about 2 weeks. He said the temperature in the freight office at night dropped below freezing, because the wood stove they had was a small thing, not built for the kind of cold that had come early this year. He said she was still working. She had taken on laundry work again, the freight business having dried up as the roads worsened, and she was making enough to eat and to pay for the wood, but not enough for a room, not in December in Sage Creek where everyone wanted a warm room and the prices had gone up. I sat with this for a day, one full day. I have learned the hard way, mostly, not to make the decisions that matter in the same hour the information arrives, because that is when the feeling is biggest and the thinking is smallest. The feeling is real and it is not wrong, but it needs the thinking alongside it, or you end up making the right decision in the wrong way. The next morning I told Broken Bow and little Axel that I was going to Sage Creek. Broken Bow, who has known me since I was 9 years old and has the irritating habit of understanding what I am doing before I have fully understood it myself, said absolutely nothing except, "Do you want company?" I said no. He nodded once, no expression. He went back to what he'd been doing. I rode out before noon. She was in the freight office. The door was not quite sealed at the bottom, and you could tell before you went in that the cold was working through it. There was a table she used as a work surface and a crate that served as a chair, and the small stove Toll had mentioned. It was going, but you could put your hand a foot from it and feel very little. She had a blanket around her shoulders that she wasn't wearing because she was comfortable. She was mending a piece of harness leather when I came in, her breath faintly visible in the cold air. She looked up. She didn't seem particularly surprised to see me, which I couldn't entirely read. I said, "Peterson told me." She said, "I figured he might." She went back to the harness leather for a moment. Then she set it down and looked at me. She said, "It's a roof. It's warmer than the wagon was." I said, "That is a very low standard." She looked at me. She said, "Most standards start low and you build them up. I'm building." I said, "How long has it been like this? Not just the freight office, like this in general." She picked up the harness leather again, set it back down again more slowly. She said, "A while." I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight." She said she would try. I said, "Have you ever had a proper room? A place that was built to keep you warm, that was yours, that had more than a floor in it?" She looked at me for a long time without answering. Outside, the wind came up and pushed at the building and the stove ticked. Somewhere in the yard a horse shifted. She said, "My mother had a house when I was small. I remember the kitchen in it. And there was a window, east-facing, in the back room, and the sun came through it in the mornings in a way that made everything warm even in winter." She paused. "After she died, I went to my stepfather's people. There wasn't a room, kitchen floor. I slept there until I was old enough to find work elsewhere." I said, "From the time you were 8 years old." She said, "I wasn't always 8, like she was correcting a fact, like the distinction was a meaningful one. She had been 8 once, and now she was not, and that was worth being precise about. Something inside my chest settled into a new arrangement. Not broke, settled. Into something that I could feel was permanent. I said, "Come with me." She said, "Where?" I said, "Home." She was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind that is actual thinking and not just pause. She said, "That is a very large thing to offer a stranger." I said, "You are not a stranger." She looked at me. Something in her gaze shifted, not suspicion, not quite trust yet, something in between those things that was trying to determine which one to become. She said, "What would I do there?" I said, "What you do. Work. We have harness to mend, hides to work, and hands are needed in a winter camp. You would have work and you would have a place." She said, "And what happens in the spring?" I said, "That is a question for the spring." She was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. The wind pushed. A horse in the yard moved and then settled. She picked up the harness leather, set it back down. She said, "Give me until morning." I said, "All right," and I went to Peterson's barn and spent the night in the hay, which was considerably warmer than the freight office. I lay there with my hands behind my head looking up at the dark rafters. I did not think through the decision that was done. I thought about something simpler and harder to name. I thought about a kitchen floor and a window that faced east and a child who slept where there was room and grew into a woman who asked for nothing because she had learned that asking didn't produce anything. And I thought about what I had in my hands, what I knew how to do, what I had always done for the people in my care, and I thought, yes, this is the thing. In the morning, she was waiting for me in the yard with a bedroll and a small bag. She had the harness leather in her hand. She'd finished the mending at some point in the night. She said, "All right." I said, "All right, let's go." We rode north. My winter camp is set in a draw below a long ridge that breaks the worst of the north wind. The cottonwoods along the creek give more shelter than you'd think, and we had spent enough winters there that the ground itself knew us. The fire circles worn into the earth, the paths between lodges kept clear by daily use, the way the horses clustered naturally upstream from the cooking area. It was not comfortable by the standards of town life. It was not meant to be. It was meant to keep 60 people alive and together through a season that would prefer otherwise, and in that it worked. Clara rode in next to me, and I watched her read it the way a practical person reads an unfamiliar situation. She looked at the fire arrangements, at the pitch of the lodges relative to the ridge at the horse line, at the path worn between the main fire and the cooking area, and what its depth told you about how long people had been moving it. She was cataloging, finding the logic underneath. She did not gawk, and she did not perform either comfort or discomfort. She said, "Where should I put my things?" I took her to my lodge, which is where things became complicated in the way things that appear simple from the outside become complicated when you step fully into them. My people are not simple about things, and they were not simple about this. Some were curious in the open way, especially the children, who came close and looked at Clara with the unguarded directness that children have before they learn to be guarded. Some of the older women were considering it carefully, with the attention that things affecting the shape of a camp require, not hostile exactly, but watching. A couple of the men watched from a distance with expressions I recognized and would deal with if I needed to. My cousin's wife, Singing Wind, showed Clara around the lodge without ceremony. She is a woman who has probably encountered most things a human life can produce, and her default response to new situations is a mild, genuine interest in what happens next. She helped Clara stow her things and pointed out where the water vessel was and how the smoke hole worked and where the spare fuel was kept. Clara followed along and asked one question about the fuel stacking, whether there was a reason it was arranged a particular way, and Singing Wind looked at her with slightly increased interest, because it was a good question, and Clara had asked it like she actually wanted to know the answer. I set Clara up on the east side of the lodge. The morning sun came through the smoke hole in that direction. I gave her my best sleeping robe, deer hide lined with a lighter skin, and she took it without ceremony and laid it out and sat on it and looked around and then at me. She said, "Thank you." I said, "There is more to come." She cocked her head. I said, "Give me a few days." She held my gaze for a moment. She did not ask what I meant. She nodded. "The Cedar." I want to explain something about what I was doing, because it was not incidental and it was not a gesture. Among my people, the place where a person sleeps, what it is made of, how much care went into it, what it says about what someone believed the person deserved, is not a small thing. I have slept on the ground, on woven mats, on robes of different qualities at different times in my life, and I know the difference in my body and I know what each arrangement says. A sleeping place is a statement. It says, "You are worth this much," or "You are worth no more than that." Clara Marsh had slept on floors since she was 8 years old. Not mats, not robes, floors, pallets, which is what you call a thin layer of something between a person and a floor when you are trying to give the arrangement a name that sounds like it belongs in a home. She had been sleeping on that floor's equivalent in one form or another for over 15 years, and not one person in all that time had looked at the situation and thought, this person deserves more than a floor. I had cedar from the previous summer, from a stand above the East Creek where we had cut poles for repair work. I had dried it right through the autumn, stacked and crossed for airflow, and it was good wood, straight-grained, dense, still fragrant when you worked it. It smelled like the inside of a good life. It had not been earmarked for anything in particular. It had been waiting without knowing it was waiting. I had the fur robes from the autumn hunt. Several of them, elk mostly, with the hides well cured and the fur coming in thick for the cold season. One bison robe with the fur still full on it. These were not surplus or cast off. These were good things, and I was choosing to use them for this. I started on the frame 4 days after she arrived. I went out to where the cedar was stored and I began to work. Broken Bow came by after a while and sat on a piece of wood about 10 feet away and began doing something with a piece of leather cord, which was his way of offering to help without making an occasion of it. I put him to work on the joining pieces while I worked on the main frame. He did not ask what I was making. He probably already knew. He is irritating that way. The work itself, I will tell you that it was satisfying in the way that careful work with good material is satisfying, which is entirely different from other satisfactions. When I am managing the band, when I am in a meeting with agency men, or settling a dispute, or planning the season's movements, the satisfaction when it goes well is real but abstract. It is the satisfaction of having pushed on an invisible thing in the right direction. When I am making something with my hands, the satisfaction is in the grain of the wood, the fit of a joint, the way a piece comes together or does not. I did the first version of one of the main joints and looked at it and could see it was not right. Not catastrophically wrong, it would have held, but it was not what I was making this for, and I took it apart and did it again. That took most of a day. The second version was right. On the 4th evening, I carried the pieces into the lodge and assembled it on the east side, between the sleeping area and the lodge wall. Cedar frame, about 8 inches from the ground, enough to lift a person up off the cold earth. If you have never spent a winter sleeping on cold ground, you might think 8 inches is a small thing. It is not a small thing. The difference between the earth and 8 inches above it in the middle of a plains winter is a thing you feel all the way through. Then the bison robe as a base, fur side up. Then 2 elk robes, also fur side up, layered so the warmth built. The 3rd elk robe folded into a cylinder for the head. Clara was across the lodge when I brought the pieces in. She had been helping Singing Wind with something, and she came back and stopped at the lodge entrance. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that I counted my own heartbeats, 8 of them I think, maybe 10. She came over and ran her hand along the cedar frame. The wood was smooth. I had worked it all the way down, taken the time. It was still fragrant in the warmth of the lodge, that dry sweet smell that cedar holds even after it's been worked. She said, "You made this." I said, "Yes." She said, "With your own hands." I said, "Yes." She said, "For me." I said, "Yes." She sat down on the edge of it slowly, the way you sit down on something when you are still determining what you are feeling. She pressed her hand into the fur of the top robe. She looked up at me. And her face was doing something I had not seen it do before and have not forgotten since. She was a woman who kept things close. I had understood this about her inside the first hour, and what was on her face right now was not kept close at all. It was open. I could not have told you exactly what it was, except that it was large and real, and had been kept somewhere for a long time. She said, "Nobody has ever built me anything." 3 words that were actually a whole life. That had underneath them the weight of not a shelf, not a fence mended, not a roof patched. Nothing made with hands and intention and placed in the world for the purpose of you, because you are worth a thing made for you. I stayed where I was. I said, "You are that kind of person." She looked at me. Her eyes were doing the thing that eyes do when a person is trying not to let the feeling show in them, and the feeling is winning anyway. She said, "How do you know that? You met me less than 2 months ago." I said, "I know enough. And I know what I am building." She held my gaze. The fire at the center of the lodge was going well, and it put a warm light across everything. Outside, a child laughed somewhere in the camp, and the cold wind pushed against the hide wall, and the poles creaked softly the way well-set poles creak when they are not going anywhere. She said, "Sit down." I found a piece of wood and sat. She said, "Tell me something about yourself, not about the band, not about where we are or the lodge or your responsibilities. Tell me something about you." It is not a question I am asked. I considered it the way it deserved to be considered. I said, "My wife died when I was 31, my son with her." She was very quiet. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I have not spoken her name in about 5 years. Not because it hurts to say it, or not only that, because it feels private, like something that belongs inside, not out. Some things lose something when you put them into words." She said, "I understand that exactly." I looked at her. I said, "What is it for you, the thing that stays private?" She looked at the fire for a moment. She said, "My mother's house, that window I told you about, the light that came in the mornings." She paused. "I don't talk about it because if I talk about it I have to talk about everything that came after it, and I have no interest in doing that. The light in the window is mine, and I don't want to share it with the rest of it." I nodded. She said, "You're the first person I've told about the window." I said, "I'll keep it." She looked at me with those creekwater eyes, and something in them settled, something that had been assessing, determining, calculating, and had now arrived somewhere and stopped moving. She nodded once slowly. She stayed. Not in the way of a guest waiting out the cold, and not only in the way of someone with nowhere better to be. She stayed in the full sense, the way you stay when you have decided that a place is worth investing yourself in, and then you invest yourself in it fully, without one foot still out the door. She learned the work. She already had capable hands and understood tools and the logic of practical work, and she picked up the winter camp's particular rhythms with the steady, unshowy attention she brought to everything. Singing wind taught her things because singing wind does not leave capable people idle. Clara learned without performing the learning. She just did the thing until she knew it, and then she did the next thing. She was good with the fire. Not building it, anyone can build a fire, but reading it. Knowing when it needed feeding, and when it needed air, and how to lay it in the morning so it would hold through the cold part of the day. She figured that out on her own by watching and adjusting. And one morning I came into the lodge and found it warm at a time of day when it usually needed attention, and I knew she had done it. She was good with the children. Not in the performing way, not crouching down and making sweet sounds and asking questions she didn't expect answers to. She treated them as people, which they found interesting because not everyone does. A few of the younger ones followed her around for a while, curious about the new person who spoke strangely and worked steadily and didn't make a fuss about them being underfoot. She learned words. Not many. The sounds were different from anything her mouth had done before, and she knew it, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But she learned the ones that mattered. Thank you, help. The word for the sky before a storm. The word we use when a thing is done right, which is a small approval word but one people like to hear. She learned them with the same flat, practical attention she brought to mending harness, and when she used one and got it close to right, she didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. I noticed. We had a disagreement in January. I include it because it matters, and because a story without the friction in it is not an honest account of anything. There was a man in the camp named Crow Walking, and his older brother, whose name I will not use because he is still living, and I have no interest in making things harder for him. They had been uncomfortable with Clara's presence from the start, not violently, not openly enough to require an immediate answer, but in the constant low-grade way of a stone in a boot. You can walk, but every step has the stone in it. Crow walking said things to other people sideways, the way men do when they are unhappy about something and lack the directness to say it to the person who could actually address it. His brother said less and watched more. I heard about it through the camp's channels, the way a chief hears about things, not always directly, but eventually all of it. I handled it, directly, privately, before it had time to become something that needed a public answer. I spoke to Crow walking alone, and I was clear about what I expected and what I would not tolerate and what the consequences would be if he did not adjust himself. I was not warm about it and I was not harsh. I was specific, and I left no room for misunderstanding. That is usually enough. What I did not anticipate was Clara. She had more Lakota than she let on by that point. She had been listening and picking up pieces, the way a person does when they are genuinely trying to understand a place rather than just move through it. And she had heard enough to know the shape of what had been happening. She came to me that evening and she said, "I don't want you to fight my battles." I said I didn't fight anything. I managed a problem in my camp. She said, "The problem is me being here." I said, "The problem is a man in my camp not behaving correctly. That is my problem to manage, not yours." She said, "Standing elk." First time she'd used my name like a full stop at the end of a sentence rather than a beginning of one. I have been managing things on my own for a long time. I am not used to someone stepping in. I said, "I understand that. I am asking you to let this one go." She said, "Why?" I thought about it. I said, "Because this is not about whether you could handle it yourself. You could. I believe that without reservation. I have seen enough of how you move through things to know that. This is about what I allow in a camp I am responsible for. Those are two different things." She looked at me. I said, "You handled everything alone for 15 years because that was what was available to you. You are not alone right now. Let me be useful to you." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might argue further, and I was ready to continue the argument if that was what was needed. She said, "You are going to be very irritating to disagree with, aren't you?" I said, "Probably." She said, "All right." And that was the end of that disagreement, except that it wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something. The beginning of her making room for me to be present in her life, not just near it. The beginning of her adjusting slightly to allow someone else to carry part of something, which for a woman who has been carrying all of it all the time is a larger adjustment than it looks from the outside. You can see it in a person when it's happening, a small loosening, a slight release of the constant running calculation. What do I have? What do I need? What happens if this goes wrong? She had been running that calculation without a break since she was 8 years old, and letting go of even a piece of it takes more than most people know. February. The cold came back hard after a brief thaw in the last week of January that fooled some people, but not the horses and not the elders, who had been watching the sky in the way that said they were not convinced. They were right. The temperature dropped again in the first days of February, and the creek froze over completely for the first time that winter, and the horses were tight and miserable, and you could hear the wind in the evenings working at everything it could reach. We had enough wood, enough food, enough shelter, all 60 people alive and accounted for. I have had worse Februaries and not all of them ended as well. I was grateful for this one. Clara and I had fallen into a pattern by then. Not a pattern you could draw on paper, not neat enough for that. More the way two people develop the habits of existing in the same space when they have stopped being careful around each other. She had her work and I had mine, and the lodge had a rhythm to it now. The fire and the sleeping and the meals, the particular quiet that settles between two people when they no longer need to fill it with sound. She told me about the freight road. The characters on it, the regular travelers, the occasional strange ones, the men who had tried to shortchange her, and how she'd handled each of them. She had an eye for the specific detail, the kind you carry because you know from experience that the details are where the danger or the opportunity lives. She noticed things and she remembered them, and when she told them back, she got the particulars right, the quality of a man's attention when he thought he wasn't being watched, the way a town changed temperature when strangers arrived, the small tells that informed you which way a situation was going before it had gone there. I told her things I had not told anyone in some time. Not the weight of the leadership. She had heard enough of that through the work of the camp, through the decisions that had to be made and the way they got made. The other things. The winter when I was 22 and 3 horses died from something in the water, and I stayed awake for most of 6 days until we moved camp and I could be sure the rest were all right. The way my uncle had looked at me when I was young, before I was leading anything, with the particular quality of attention that tells a young man someone believes he will become something worth believing in. She listened the way a person listens when they are actually receiving what is being said, and not just waiting for the gap to say their own thing. One night in the middle of February, very cold, she was on the cedar bed with the elk robe around her shoulders working on a piece of mending, her hands always in motion when she was sitting still, and I was on the other side of the fire working on a piece of tack that needed attention. The lodge was settled and warm. The wind was at the walls and the fire held and everything in it was still. She said without looking up, "I want to stay." Not a question, not tentative, the statement of something already decided. I looked up. She said, "Past spring, I'm not going back to the freight road." I set the tack down on the ground beside me. She looked up from the mending and found my eyes and held them. I said, "Clara." She said, "I know what I'm saying." I said, "What do you want?" She said, "This, here, you." She said it the same way she said most things, plainly, without decoration, as if the plain version were the only version worth saying. I have been trying to work out for 2 months what this is and what I am doing and whether I'm being reckless or foolish or something else I don't have a word for. And the only thing I keep coming back to is that this is the first place I have felt like myself since I was small enough to sit in the light of that window. I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "I know what I feel for you." She said, "Say it." I said, "I have built 2 things with my hands in my life that I loved while I was building them. My uncle's burial scaffold because he asked me to and I wanted to do it right. And that bed you are sitting on." I stopped. "That is the kind of thing I have for you. The kind that builds. The kind that is made on purpose and built to last and is not done when it's done because you keep finding places to make it better." She was very still. She said, "That is not the easiest thing to hear." I said I knew. She said, "It is also the best thing anyone has ever said to me." She stood up from the cedar bed and came around the fire and sat down next to me, close, her shoulder against mine, the warmth of her through the layers of hide and wool. She put her hand over mine where it rested on the piece of tack, left it there. I turned my hand over and held hers. Her hand was small in mine and calloused and warm. We stayed like that for a long time, the wind at the walls, the fire holding. There was a night in late February, the coldest night of that whole winter, the kind of cold that has its own sound, a silence in it that is not quiet at all but the absence of everything that cannot survive it. When I woke at some hour before first light, and the fire had gotten low, and I lay still for a moment before getting up to tend it. Clara was awake too. She was on the cedar bed, lying on her side, looking at the fire, and I knew she had been awake for some time. She had not said anything, and she did not say anything now. She was just there, watching the coals, and the low red light of them was on her face. I got up and built the fire back and came back to where I had been lying, and for a while neither of us said anything. The lodge was warming. The cold outside pressed at the walls. You could hear it. She said, "What do you think about when you're awake at this hour?" I said, "Whatever needs thinking about." She said, "Right now." I thought about it. I said, "The East Creek. I want to clear some of the deadfall before the snow melt so the runoff doesn't back up the way it did 2 years ago. I've been putting it off." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most practical thing I have ever heard anyone say at 3 in the morning." I said, "What do you think about?" She said, "Usually what I need to do next. What I'm owed, what I owe, what needs to happen in what order." She paused. "Sometimes just sounds, the wagon on the road. The way the laundry steam smelled in the morning." I said, "Good memories or bad?" She said, "Just memories. I stopped sorting them a while back." I thought about that. I said, "What do you think about tonight?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she might not answer. She said, "This, the fire, the sound of the wind." A pause. "You." She said it the same way she said most things, without announcement, without making it a moment. Like it was just a fact about what was happening in her mind, no different from the deadfall in the East Creek. I lay there in the warmth of the rebuilt fire and listened to the cold outside and felt the truth of where I was. And I did not say anything else, and neither did she. And after a while the sounds of the camp outside in the very early morning began, a horse shifting, someone feeding another fire somewhere in the draw, and the night became the beginning of the day, the way it always does whether you are ready for it or not. Spring came the way it always does on the plains, mud first, then the first pale grass uncertain about itself, then the sky changing quality in a way that is hard to describe but unmistakable if you live outdoors. Like the light has been given permission to do more. The horses knew before anyone else. They always do. There were decisions to make and navigating to do, and I will not pretend otherwise. Some of it I handled early, quietly, before it required a public answer. Some of it was harder and took longer. The agency people had opinions, as agency people always have opinions, and a few men in Sage Creek and in Laramie who heard about Clara Marsh's choice had their own reactions. I dealt with each of these things as they came, directly, early, and clearly. That is the only way I know to deal with them. What I will tell you about is the morning in late April when the snow was fully gone from the high ground, and the world had made its decision to go green again. I was at the east edge of the camp, where I go in the morning sometimes to think, or sometimes just to be, without anyone needing something from me for a while. The light was coming in low off the ridge, gold and level, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look chosen. I heard her coming before I saw her. I had learned the particular sound of her walk by then. She stood beside me, close. She said, "There's a window." I said I knew. She said, "It faces east." I had placed the lodge that way on purpose in the fall, when I was thinking about what I was building, before I fully understood what I was building toward. And she knew that. We both knew it, and neither of us said it, which is a thing you can do with a person once you have been in the same space long enough to know what the other one already knows. She said, "The light comes in exactly the way I remembered it, from when I was small. I thought maybe I had made it up over the years, the way things from that far back get, but it's the same. It's the same light." She turned and looked at me. Her hand found my arm and she held it, fingers wrapped around my forearm, and there was nothing tentative in it. The grip of someone who knows where they are and is not going anywhere away from it. She said, "I haven't been afraid since November." I looked at her. She said, "That's the longest I can remember, maybe ever." She paused. "I keep waiting for it to come back." I said, "It may." She said, "I know, but I think it will be different when it does because I won't be deciding alone." I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me, her shoulders settling against my chest, her weight certain and right. We stood in the morning light on the ridge and watched the new grass come visible in the draw below as the sun climbed, and the shadows shortened, and the day began. I want to tell you something I have come to understand in the years since that winter. I have been a chief since I was 32. Before that, I was being trained for it, which is a different kind of thing. It has the preparation but not the weight. The weight is the knowledge, present every waking hour, that 60 people are alive or not, partly based on what you decide and how you move and whether you get the important things right. It changes how you exist. You become the fixed point. The place people look when the sky does something threatening, when the food runs short, when two men have a dispute that will become violence if it is not addressed. You become the stone in the current. A stone in a current is not asked how it feels. A stone in a current is not asked what it carries or what it has lost or what it needs. It is asked to hold steady, and it holds steady, and that is the whole of the relationship. Clara Marsh asked me, not once as a formality and not early before she had a right to. She asked me when she had earned the right, and she meant the question, and she waited for the actual answer. And she could tell the difference between the official answer and the actual one. She had spent enough years reading situations for her own survival that she could read a man the same way, and she didn't pretend she couldn't. And she told me things. Not everything at once. That is not who she is, and it is not what I wanted or what would have been right. She told me things as she decided to trust them to me. The freight road, the laundry, the boarding houses and the floors, the mother and the window and the 15 years after. She gave these things carefully, one at a time. The way you give something breakable to someone you are still determining whether to trust with breakable things. I tried to be worth the trust. I hope I was. I believe I was. The cedar bed is still in the lodge. It has been in the lodge for several years now, and it is as solid as the day I assembled it, which is how I built it. Clara sanded it herself in the second spring, worked it smoother than I had gotten it, which I will not pretend did not irritate me a little, and which she found unreasonably funny. She added a piece on the side in the same season, a lower rail, because she had found a length of good cedar, and it seemed a waste not to use it. She fitted it into the existing frame cleanly, and it was a good addition, and I told her so, and she said she knew. She built onto it is what I am telling you. She took the thing I made and she added to it. That is who she is. That is the kind of woman who stayed. I think about November sometimes. The freight road in the dark. The wagon sitting crooked in the dirt, no horse, no help coming. Her under that canvas tarp with her feet sticking out deciding. She'd said that. I was trying to decide what to do. Already working the problem. Already planning for the version where the help didn't come because the help had never come, and she knew how to live in that version and she would have made it through somehow, the way she had always made it through somehow. I am glad little Axel was looking where he was looking. I am glad I got down off that horse. The ridge in the morning, the light coming east across the new grass, her shoulder under my arm, warm and certain, not going anywhere. And me, standing elk, who had been the stone in the current for 11 years, finally with a woman who looked at the stone and saw the man inside it and stayed to see more. That is where this story lives. Not in what she got from me, though I gave her what I had and it was enough. In what I got from her, which was the thing I had not known I had been without. The simple, enormous thing of being seen, being chosen, building something and having someone build back. The light is good in the mornings. It always was. It always is.